Genevieve's eyes drifted over the grand stage of the opera house, its sweeping curtains framing the hushed seats. A few years ago, she had stood in the very center of those burnished floorboards, commanding the attention of every pair of eyes in attendance. Her voice had soared to the rafters, weaving aria after aria in perfect pitch and stirring emotion in all who listened. These days, however, she could hardly step onto the stage without a swell of grief and longing. The day she lost her voice seemed like a cursed memory she was never free of, a silent echo that mocked her passion. Her daily routine, once defined by hours of vocal rehearsals and theatrical exercises, had taken an unrecognizable shape. She still visited the opera house, though she was no longer the star, but rather an occasional backstage assistant, organizing props and fussing over costumes. Everyone who worked there knew her story and treated her kindly, yet there was always a sorrowful sympathy in their eyes, a reflection of her own frustration. She had tried everything: rest, herbal concoctions, doctors, and even spells cast by well-meaning mystics. Still, whenever she opened her mouth, the sound was barely more than a rasp. Over time, her belief in a cure waned. She felt like a singer destined to exist in forced silence. The persistent ache in her throat was neither painful nor comfortable, rather, it was an emptiness, a longing for the melodic resonance that once defined her life. As she fit a final emerald brooch onto a lead soprano's gown, her body tensed at the voice streaming in from the stage. The soprano was warming up, hitting bright, effortless notes with remarkable precision. Each note seemed a reminder of what Genevieve deemed stolen. Though no wrongdoing could truly be pinned, her tears threatened to surface, and she quickly adjusted the gown's shoulder strap to hide her trembling chin. That night, feeling restless, she wandered the corridors that snaked beneath the auditorium. The subterranean hallways were lined with practice rooms. One space was devoted to storing old pianos that had served the company well across decades. The door was ajar, and a faint melody floated out. Curiosity, combined with her yearning for anything musical, urged her to step inside. There, seated at one of the oldest upright pianos, was a man she recognized only by sight. He had been around the opera house for about a month, politely greeting the stage hands and occasionally emerging, covered in a fine layer of sawdust. His sleeves were always rolled up to the elbows, his hands calloused from what was clearly an artisan's labor. She knew him only as Thomas, the piano tuner. He was hunched over the piano's open top, adjusting tuning pins and plucking a string. He played a few hesitant chords, the notes sounding full and resonant. But then he grimaced, shook his head, and turned the pegs again. From the patchy illumination of a ragged overhead bulb, she observed just how meticulous he was. Tuning pianos wasn't just a job for him, it was an art, a patient kind of devotion. Genevieve felt her throat hitch, that familiar emptiness reminding her that pianos, at least, could still speak. She feared intruding on his concentration, but her desire to hear music was stronger than her reticence. Before she could think twice, she let her heels click softly on the wooden floor as she stepped inside. Thomas noticed the movement and turned. "I'm sorry," she croaked. Her voice, even in that single phrase, felt like shards of glass scraping her throat. She cleared it self-consciously and tried again, weaker. "I didn't mean to bother you." Thomas straightened up. She could see genuine concern etched in his features. "You're not a bother," he said in a gentle tone. "Do you need the room? I can come back later." She shook her head. With a flustered gesture, she explained, "No, I was just curious." Another wave of discomfort rose at the scratchiness of her voice. "I love hearing pianos, and yours caught my ear." His face softened. "Would you like me to play something? I'm not a concert pianist, but I can manage a tune." Seeing genuine kindness radiate from him was enough to set her at ease, at least partially. She nodded and eased onto an old wooden bench by the wall. He fiddled with the piano's innards for a moment longer, plucking a few strings, turning a tuning pin, then releasing the top. His hands settled on the keys in a tentative chord progression. Slowly, a gentle melody emerged, delicate arpeggios blending into warm chords. Genevieve found herself leaning forward just to feel the vibrations in her soul. It wasn't a grand performance or an especially challenging piece, but it was alive with sincerity. When he finished, she offered a subdued applause by tapping her fingertips together, a gesture she'd adopted because clapping sometimes sent a painful jolt through her throat. Thomas smiled briefly. I usually tune them, but rarely get to play for anyone, he admitted. Hope it wasn't too off? She shook her head. It was lovely, she whispered. Then, compelled by her need to share, she added, I used to sing. He didn't respond with the immediate pity she had come to expect. Instead, he merely nodded, as though he respected that piece of information, without giving in to sympathy. Does the singing not come to you anymore? He asked gently. She tried to explain, halting every sentence to find a word that wouldn't strain her fragile vocal cords. Thomas listened carefully, his eyes meeting hers. She told him of the day her throat locked under stress and vocal fatigue. She recounted how she'd done everything to bring her voice back, only to face repeated failures. She ended with the admission that she now busied herself backstage with costume details and set design to remain close to the world she loved. He studied her with an earnest expression. I'm sorry you've had to suffer that, he finally said, but please don't give up hope. In the humble glow of that neglected practice room, Genevieve felt something inside her stir. Not quite optimism yet, but a faint warmth that felt like encouragement. The days that followed passed more predictably, though she noticed that whenever she found an after-mez reason to be at the opera house, Thomas was there. Sometimes he was busy tuning one piano, other times examining the mechanics of an antique upright. He always greeted her with an unassuming smile. Occasionally, he'd stop his work to play her a short improvisation, a snippet of a classical piece, or a scale pattern that might open a conversation about music's mystery. She spoke little, but she listened raptly, letting the notes fill the void her own voice had left behind. It soon became their unspoken ritual. If she tiptoed into a practice room and found him alone, they might chat for a few minutes before letting the piano do most of the talking. If she was busy, he'd simply wave. Once or twice, he asked how she was feeling. And though the answer was never bright, it felt comforting just to know he cared to ask. One night, as rain battered the opera house's windows, she arrived later than usual to retrieve a costume piece. While rushing down the corridor, she heard a voice. No, more of an echo. It was too pure to be a machine or a recording. She froze, goosebumps peppering her arms. She recognized her own voice in that brightness, a memory of it, at least, seizing her emotions. Confused, she slowly opened the door. Thomas stood by an old reel-to-reel tape player. He turned around in surprise. I found some old recordings, he said softly. I came across them in a storage box with the older pianos. I was trying to see which singer was on them. Then I realized. It must be you. Genevieve stepped closer, hearing the radiant soprano line. She realized immediately it was from her breakthrough performance. The run of an opera that had made her name known, the texture of the tone, the vibrato that was so distinctly hers, struck with haunted precision. She felt tears prick her eyes. Thomas gently clicked the player off. I didn't mean to intrude on your privacy, but it's a lovely performance, he paused. You must miss it very much. She swallowed, ignoring the dryness in her throat. I do, she whispered shakily. So much. Would you like to listen to more of it? He offered tentatively. Or does it hurt too much? She drew in a tremulous breath. I do want to hear it, she said, forcing each word through the strain. I want to remember what it felt like. With a careful nod, he turned it back on, letting her voice flood the room. For a long while, they said nothing. The final note in that particular aria soared across the scratched surface of the old tape, echoing in a room that was otherwise a shrine to battered pianos and silent dreams. Genevieve didn't move until the reel spun to an end, leaving behind a hush that felt impossibly large. Then Thomas spoke, his words softly bridging the gap. "Sometimes," he said, "when I hear a piano that's badly out of tune, I'm convinced it's gone forever. No one will be able to restore it. But with patience, attention, and the right techniques, I find that hidden clarity again. Maybe the voice is like that, requiring not just some miracle cure, but a slow, deliberate process." Genevieve stared at the reel to reel. "I hope so," she whispered. She longed to believe him. Their relationship deepened as the weeks wore on. Thomas asked gentle questions about her favorite compositions, her warm up routines from back in the day, and the times she felt strongest on stage. He never peppered her with medical advice. She'd already had more than she could stomach. He simply listened, as if every memory was a part of a puzzle that might lead to lost treasure. Sometimes, when the nights were especially quiet, she bravely tried to hum along with his piano chords. The first attempts were heartbreakingly faint. Her breath would hitch, her voice faltering after only a few notes. He never commented on the brokenness. He only invited her to try again, his left hand patiently guiding the harmonic flow, while his right hand added melodic lines that accommodated her limited range. Though progress was agonizingly slow, she noted gradual changes. At first, she hadn't been able to produce sound above a whisper. Now she could hold a note for a short duration, still raspy but tangible. She credited it partly to Tomas's unwavering belief that the remains of her voice could be coaxed out of hiding. But another part, perhaps less scientific, was tied to her blossoming affection for him. She found herself lingering at the opera house each day, hoping to catch him between jobs, just so they could share another moment. An evening came when they found themselves alone in the main auditorium. A massive crystal chandelier loomed overhead, each drop shimmering under the subdued house lights. Thomas was testing the large, black grand piano on the stage, ensuring it was ready for the next performance. Genevieve slid into the seat beside him. "You look tired," she said softly, her voice a little steadier than usual. He grimaced, rubbing his neck. "It's been a long day. 3 pianos in one afternoon. Seems like everyone requested final tunings before tomorrow's big show." She laced her fingers. "I'm not sure there's anything I can do, but I can listen or keep you company." He gave a small, appreciative laugh. "Thank you. Honestly, your company is the best thing right now." She smiled, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the overhead lights. Without much thought, she placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. He tensed, not out of discomfort, but as though he was startled by how natural the gesture felt. She let her hand fall away, unsure if she'd overstepped, but he simply covered her hand with his for a moment before returning to the keys. In that moment, she saw in him a certain vulnerability mirrored in herself. He had never bragged or displayed any flashiness. Rather, he was a man who found fulfillment in quietly restoring instruments, letting them, in turn, restore him. That sense of mutual healing bound them tighter than any fleeting attraction, and she realized that while he patiently tuned pianos, he was also quietly tuning her heart, giving her the confidence and space to believe she could sing once more. And the next day, the opera house was all abuzz with final rehearsals for a new production. A flamboyant tenor pranced about, warming up in the corridors, while costume designers chased side characters for fittings. Genevieve raced through her tasks, helping adjust a stubborn seam on a dancer's attire, then delivering a tray of refreshments to the exhausted stagehands. Whenever she passed Tomas, who was busy loading his tools, she shot him an encouraging smile. That night, after the new opera's final curtain call, the cast and staff gathered in the foyer for a small celebration. Sparkling wine was poured, and the leading soprano dominated conversation with her triumph of the evening, though she offered a backhanded compliment to the rest of the crew with, "I suppose it's us principals who hold up the stage, but you behind-the-scenes folk do a fine job." Genevieve clenched her jaw, feeling the sting. Thomas sidled up to her, offering a glass. "You okay?" She nodded, taking a polite sip. The sweet fizz tickled her throat, prompting a small, quiet cough. Yes, just that was me once, she admitted with candor. They wouldn't be nearly as good if they didn't have your help now, he replied, raising his glass as if in a toast. For what it's worth, you're still every bit the star in my eyes. She felt the sting of tears pressing behind her lids. She swallowed them down, grateful for his kindness. Warmth flooded her at his unvarnished sincerity. Thank you, Thomas, she breathed, and though her voice was fragile, it was audible, laced with emotion. Later, she slipped away from the revelers, weaving through the corridors until she reached an unoccupied practice room. She needed a moment of quiet. The hollowness in her mind was a mix of nostalgia, envy, and a renewed spark of hope that somehow she might rejoin the ranks of singers on that stage one day. She found a seat by an upright piano. As her fingers grazed the keys, she realized how rarely she'd tried to play for herself. The memory of some chord progressions flickered. She pressed down gently. The piano was slightly out of tune. Thomas hadn't gotten to this one yet, but it still held enough harmony to please the ear. She pressed the keys again, slower this time, searching for the chord she used to warm up with in her singing days. She hummed a note quietly. It came out shaky, but still more substantial than it had been in ages. Unexpectedly, the door cracked open. Thomas poked his head in. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you, he said, stepping inside. I wondered where you disappeared to. He turned his gaze to the piano. Are you playing? She nodded. I was just thinking about the chord progressions I used to use when I warmed up. A small flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks. I hope it doesn't sound too terrible. He slid onto the bench beside her. Play whatever you can. And if you feel like singing, I can try to follow you. Surprise even herself, she pressed a chord, then tried a single note. It warbled at first, but she shifted her posture, inhaled, and tried again. A faint measure of the old resonance returned, a flicker of the stage presence she once commanded. Thomas adjusted his playing, gently coaxing her to move to the next note. She followed, uncertain and breathy, but for nearly half a minute she managed an unbroken scale. When she stopped, she realized her hands were trembling with a mixture of fear and elation. He gazed at her, a radiant expression lighting his face. Did you feel that? She nodded, marveling at it. It's a bit closer than before, she said softly. This sentence alone was a testament. Her voice didn't crack in the middle of it. His voice lowered, emotionally charged. Genevieve, don't stop now. So she tried again. Each scale was an act of both bravery and vulnerability. She rose to the mid-range of her register without succumbing to the dryness. Thomas's chord changes provided unwavering support. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She had not realized how deeply she'd missed the act of singing and how desperately she wanted it back. In the whirlwind weeks that followed, she continued these quiet sessions with Thomas in between his work. Gradually, strength came back to her diaphragm. She disciplined herself, following gentle exercises gleaned from her vocal coach's old notes, combined with Thomas's improvised piano line. Whenever frustration threatened to capsize her, he soothed her with calm words, or simply let her place her forehead against the cool wood of the piano until she was ready to try again. More than once, their hands brushed in silent solidarity. Over time, she wondered if another kind of love was taking shape within her. An admiration that went beyond gratitude. And one evening, when she hadn't shown up at the usual time, Thomas came looking for her in the costume department, only to find her hunched over a stool, massaging her throat. She couldn't get a decent sound out. Her voice had cracked earlier, and anxiety had seized her. Wordlessly, Thomas knelt in front of her and pressed a small cup of warm water with honey into her hands. You're tired, he said, brushing his fingertips gently across her forehead. You need rest. I don't want you to overstrain yourself. She stared, her eyes shining with tears brimming at the edges. I was so close, she rasped. I don't want to lose that progress. You won't, he reassured her. Trust me. Sometimes you have to loosen the tuning pins, let them settle before you can properly tighten them again. That's how it is with pianos. Maybe it's the same with your voice. She sipped the honeyed water, letting its warmth coat her aching throat. Then, despite her weariness, she lifted a hand to cup his cheek. Her eyes brimmed not only with tears, but with a deeply felt emotion she'd never shared with him in words. Thomas, you've done so much, she managed. He leaned his forehead against hers, energy vibrating between them with the hush of a secret. It's a privilege, he said simply, and for a protracted moment the world outside vanished, leaving just the two of them, locked in a gentle closeness that was as healing as any drug. In the weeks that followed, one of the leading sopranos hurt her ankle and had to withdraw from an upcoming benefit concert. The opera director, in a scramble, approached Genevieve out of courtesy, knowing her predicament, but wanting to see if she might step in somehow. We can't find a replacement who knows the repertoire at such short notice, the director said. We could have you stand on stage to act the role while someone else sings from backstage, but I'm not sure if you'd want to do that. To everyone's surprise, Genevieve bit her lip, thinking it over. She had been practicing daily with Tomas, and her range had improved to at least partial capacity. Though she couldn't match her old performance level, she had a glimmer of competence now. Perhaps she could pair that with her theatrical instincts. I want to try, she found herself saying, her voice firm. Let me see if I can manage the parts. The director blinked in astonishment. Oh, of course, if you'd like. You'll have just a few days to prepare. Adrenaline spiked through her, and that night she rushed to Thomas with the news. They've given me a chance, she said, excitement burning in her chest. I have to learn a few solo pieces from an older score, but they're well within my voice range if I don't push too hard. Could you help me practice? Thomas's face lit up. Though the assignment was daunting, he saw the courage in her eyes. Absolutely, he said, rummaging for the musical score she had brought. We'll do this together. Their sessions in the old practice room became more frequent and intense. For hours, Thomas hammered out the melodic lines, adjusting the tempo based on Genevieve's signals. She slowly found ways to navigate her once lost strengths, bridging breath support with fleeting bursts of emotion. Each time she faltered or grew frustrated, he'd rest his hand on hers, reminding her to be patient. And each time she pulled off even a single phrase with a measure of clarity, his eyes sparked with encouragement. Their bond deepened, a mutual trust forging a path where once there was only silence. On the night of the benefit concert, the opera house was filled with donors and patrons eager to see a glimmer of classical performance. Genevieve, dressed in a shimmering midnight hue gown, the fabric caressing her skin like a promise of renewed dreams. Her hands shook as she fastened her earrings. Would her voice hold out in front of so many? Her heart hammered like a timpani drum. Backstage, Thomas waited in the wings. He was not expected to be on stage, but he'd volunteered to be the one at the piano if they needed to fill space between acts. The official accompanist was a seasoned staff pianist, yet Thomas had quietly offered to be a standby. Genevieve suspected it was less about playing and more about being close enough to lend moral support. Before she stepped on stage for her piece, he caught her gaze from the side curtains and mouthed, "I believe in you." She took a shaky breath, feeling the hush that fell over the crowd as the lights dimmed. The MC announced her name, and a swirl of surprise went through the audience. Many recognized her as the once revered soprano who had mysteriously vanished from the spotlight. As she stepped under the brilliant stage lights, her pulse roared behind her ears. She cast her eyes briefly to the side, saw Thomas nod, and the opening bars of the orchestral cue began. The music resonated in her bones, reminding her of a long-lost home. She opened her mouth, heart trembling with equal parts fear and hope. The first note blossomed forth. Though not as powerful or flawless as it had once been, it was undeniable. She was singing. Her voice quavered, threatened to crack at a high point, but she managed to hold the note. There was a softness, a depth she hadn't possessed, perhaps tempered by the adversity she'd been through. The audience was hushed, leaning in as though they weren't sure if the moment was real. And as she moved from phrase to phrase, she could hear not only her voice echo off the gilded walls, but also feel the presence of Tomas's unwavering faith, like a current that carried her forward. When the final note drifted into silence, she almost couldn't believe it had happened. Time seemed to freeze for a single heartbeat. Then the audience erupted, applause rolling over her like a cresting wave. She sagged with emotion, tears shimmering on her lashes. She glanced to the side, found Thomas standing there in the dark, clapping with genuine pride burning in his eyes. That night, as the final bows took place, she emerged from backstage, her cheeks still flushed. She felt lighter, a sense of homecoming coursing through her veins. After the event, the patrons mingled, exclaiming how wonderful it was to see her back on stage, if only for a short piece. Genevieve eventually slipped away from the crowd, searching out Thomas. She found him beside the old grand piano, packing up some scattered sheets of music. The low house lights traced the softness of his profile. She walked up to him, her voice, still fragile but far better than before, emerged with quiet resolution. "I couldn't have done this without you." He turned, that affectionate grin lighting up his features. "You've found your voice. I just helped tune it a bit." Impulsively, she moved closer. Her hand sought his, linking their fingers in a gentle clasp. "Tomas," she whispered, feeling the tears well fresh again. "I." He didn't wait for her to finish. Instead, he leaned in and, with delicate caution, pressed his lips to hers. The hush of the nearly empty auditorium seemed to cradle them, as though it too recognized the tenderness of that moment. His honesty and gentle persistence spoke volumes that her newly refound voice could never fully articulate, and as they pulled back, both breathless and lightly trembling, a shared thought coursed between them. Healing, love, and music had woven their lives together in ways neither had anticipated. They stood there for a long time, content in the knowledge that while they might each face challenges ahead, they could do so with renewed strength. He brushed a stray curl away from her forehead, cupping her cheek. "You're going to keep singing," he said softly, more a request than a statement. She let out a soft, breathy laugh, tears shining in her eyes. "With you by my side," she replied, her voice steady in its quiet rebirth. "I think I'll find any note I need." Outside the opera house, a few staff milled about, locking doors, flipping switches. But Genevieve and Tomas lingered on that stage, reluctant to let the moment slip away. The thick red curtains loomed overhead, waiting to close on this night's spectacle. Yet for them it felt like the first possible opening of a new act in their lives. The hush of the empty seats gave them a private audience. "Let's do one more scale," he teased with a grin, turning to the piano. She joined him, letting the gentle chords fill the space. This time, her voice rose with newfound confidence. It was not percussive or thunderous, but it glided through the notes with a warm vibrato, and as the final tone melted away, it left behind a promise that her voice was returning. And in tandem, so was the vibrant heart behind it. In that dual rediscovery voice and love, they found a rare harmony. And though the challenges of tomorrow remained, they knew they would face them hand in hand, held together by the steady pulse of devotion that had, against all odds, brought music back to her lips and hope into both their hearts.